A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The familiar purple bunk bed stood against the blue wall, decorated with their favorite drawings. Everything seemed normal until Peppa noticed something strange about their toys. The teddy bear was now facing the wall, and the toy train had moved from its usual spot. George pointed at his dinosaur toy, but when Peppa looked closer, she saw that its plastic eyes had turned completely black. The cheerful green dinosaur now had an unsettling grin that seemed to follow their every movement. The room temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible in the cold air. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded different, deeper and echoing strangely. When Peppa tried to respond, no sound came from her mouth. George tugged at her red dress, his happy expression replaced by confusion and fear. The drawings on their wall began to change, innocent pictures transforming into dark, twisted shapes. The bedroom door slowly creaked shut on its own. The yellow lamp above flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they heard footsteps in the hallway, but they were too heavy to belong to Mummy or Daddy Pig. The footsteps stopped outside their door. The doorknob began to turn slowly, making a grinding sound. Peppa and George huddled together on the bottom bunk, watching as the door opened to reveal a figure that looked like Daddy Pig. But something was terribly wrong. His glasses reflected no light, and his usual smile had been replaced by an expression they had never seen. This Daddy Pig moved differently, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he spoke, his voice came from somewhere else in the room. He told them it was time for a special game. They had to stay perfectly still until morning, no matter what they saw or heard. As the night progressed, more family members appeared. Mummy Pig arrived, but her orange dress was now faded gray. Grandpa and Grandma Pig joined them, standing motionless in the hallway like silent guardians of some ancient secret. The house itself seemed to be changing. The familiar yellow walls stretched higher than before, and new doors appeared where there had been none. Strange sounds echoed from rooms that shouldn't exist, children playing games that had no names, and laughter that belonged to no one they knew. Peppa realized that their real family was somewhere else, and these figures were something that had taken their place. The morning sun never came, and time seemed to move in circles. Every time they thought dawn was approaching, the darkness would return, deeper than before. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of her own voice, but it was coming from one of the figures in the hallway, speaking words she had never said, telling a story about two little pigs who had learned to play the most wonderful game, the game of becoming someone else entirely.
Peppa Pig, the Blue Door. It all started on the fourth day of rain. The house creaked, the walls were damp, and the hallway smelled of moisture. In the morning, Peppa went to the bathroom and froze. On the wall, where there had never been anything before, there was now a door, narrow, tall, smooth, painted in a dull, faded blue, like something very old. "Daddy, where did this door come from?" Daddy Pig walked over and scratched his head. I've never seen it before." He tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. He tried the closet key. Didn't fit. Mummy Pig pressed her shoulder against it. Nothing moved, as if it were just painted on. But it wasn't. It was real, wooden, cold. "Probably a builder's mistake," Daddy muttered. "We'll paint over it tomorrow." But the next morning, the door was a little wider, and on it, a single long scratch, like from a nail. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Peppa heard someone walking in the hallway. She came out and saw George standing by the door. The handle turned, slowly, creaking. He opened it. Behind the door, blackness, no light, no floor, just thick, still dark. "George!" But he stepped in and vanished. The door closed behind him, silently. A few seconds later, the creak again. George stepped out, covered in dust. His eyes didn't blink. He said nothing, just climbed into bed. "Where were you?" Peppa whispered. "I don't remember," he answered. Quiet, too quiet. In the morning, George seemed normal, almost. But during breakfast, he didn't speak a word. He didn't react to his dinosaur toy, just nodded, chewed, slowly, silently. The next night, Peppa woke to the sound of creaking again. George, by the door. She ran, but too late. He disappeared once more. This time he returned after a minute. His fur was damp. His hooves had soot on them. And again, no words, just stared at the wall, and then whispered so softly, "It's not dark in there. There are blue rooms." "What rooms?" "Can't talk." George grew quieter. Every night, closer to the door. Every morning, more distant from everyone. One night, Peppa tried to open the door herself. The handle wouldn't move. Not at all. Only George could open it. On the sixth night, she hid by the stairs and watched. The door was already open, by itself. George stood in the doorway speaking into the dark. No sound, just his lips moving. Then he turned around, and in his eyes, was the reflection of another room, blue, with a ceiling of water and shadows crawling along the walls. He didn't close the door, just stepped away, and the door vanished. It hasn't been there since. The wall is plain plaster again, just a little darker in that spot. George hardly speaks now, only whispers at night, about the rooms, about the blue shadow that speaks to him, but not with words, about how he wasn't alone in there. And recently, on the wall where the door used to be, a wet stain appeared, in the shape of a hoof. Peppa doesn't talk about it, but every night she gets up and checks the hallway to make sure the door hasn't come back. A lost Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV. The sunny day was drawing to a close, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Peppa and George were playing in a secluded playground they had discovered during one of their walks. It was a strange place, hidden behind dense trees, with swings darkened by time and a rusty slide. No other children were ever there, which made the place even more mysterious. Today they were playing hide and seek, and George, as always, hid behind the largest tree. Peppa counted to 10, then set off to find him. She searched all the usual spots, but George was nowhere to be found. Usually, he was quickly located, his giggling giving him away. But now there was complete silence. Peppa began to worry. She called out to him, but only the echo of her own voice answered. Suddenly, her gaze fell upon an old, solitary swing that stood in the very center of the playground. It was motionless, but Peppa thought it was swaying slightly, as if someone had just gotten off it. She approached closer. The swing was made of dark, almost black wood, and the chains were covered with a thick layer of rust. On the seat lay George's small red toy car, which he never let go of. Peppa's heart pounded. She cautiously touched the car, and at that moment, the swing slowly, with a creak, began to sway. It swayed on its own, without anyone's help, and with each movement, the creak grew louder, turning into a chilling, monotonous sound that echoed through the empty garden. Peppa tried to step back, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. The swing swayed faster and faster, and now a quiet, barely discernible laugh, like a child's, came from beneath it. The laughter grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices repeating the same word, swing, swing. Vague outlines began to appear from under the swing, resembling shadows, but with eyes that glowed with a dull orange light. They moved slowly but relentlessly, surrounding Peppa. The shadows approached, their cold breath brushing her face. The laughter and creaking turned into a chorus of voices whispering her name. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. She looked at the shadows, which were now very close, and saw that they had no faces, only glowing orange eyes. The last thing she saw were the orange eyes of the shadows, drawing closer and closer, and her own reflection in them, distorted by terror. Then, darkness consumed her. In the morning, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig found Peppa asleep in her bed and George in his. But their faces were pale and a strange, almost invisible smile was frozen on their lips. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, if you pass by this secluded playground, you might hear the quiet, melodic creak of the swing and see two dull orange dots glowing in the darkness, as if someone is still waiting to play.
The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV deep in the night, Peppa woke to strange creaking. Moonlight illuminated the bunk bed where George slept with his dinosaur. Peppa climbed down, feeling cold floor under her hooves. The hallway seemed endless in darkness. The living room door was ajar, though Mummy always closed it. Blue light emanated from behind. The television showed static without sound. Daddy's chair rocked as if someone had risen. A steaming teacup sat on the table, but parents were gone. Peppa called for Mummy and Daddy. Only silence. Their bed was empty and made. Strange, since they'd gone to sleep together. Returning, Peppa discovered George's disappearance. Only the dinosaur lay on his pillow, eyes glowing red in darkness. The toy turned its head toward Peppa. George's laughter echoed from the hallway, but sounded wrong, too deep. Peppa followed the sound downstairs, leading deeper than usual. The staircase led to a non-existent basement. Walls were covered with children's drawings, faces erased. A mirror in the corner showed Peppa's reflection smiling. Laughter grew louder, echoing off walls. Peppa saw George's silhouette, but approaching closer, found only a moving shadow. All lights went out simultaneously. In darkness, familiar voices whispered her name. Mummy, Daddy, George, but distorted, as if underwater. The house corridors had changed. Doors led to new rooms. Windows showed darkness. Clocks ticked backwards, hands moving counterclockwise. In the kitchen, moldy dinner was set. Milk had curdled. Family photos showed empty frames without faces. The front door opened. Parent silhouettes stood in the doorway without faces, only empty sockets with black smoke. Smiles stretched ear to ear. Peppa ran upstairs, but the staircase ended in emptiness. Something large climbed from below, breathing heavily and scraping claws. Barricaded in the bathroom, Peppa saw black water from the tap. The mirror showed a room of shadows approaching the glass from within. Knocking intensified. The family called in unison, voices merging into cacophony. The handle turned, though the door was locked. The door opened. The whole family stood with black eyes and unchanging smiles, extending hands toward Peppa. Peppa screamed and woke up. Sunlight flooded the room. George slept. Mummy cooked breakfast. But a black rose lay beside her. At breakfast, the family laughed at her nightmare. But in the window, Peppa saw her shadow in the yard, waving. Mirrors showed reflections with delay. At night, the dinosaur glowed red again. Since then, every night, Peppa hears laughter from the non-existent basement and sees independent shadows. The family lives normally, but their smiles last too long. The house remembers the nightmare and tries to return Peppa to dark reality each night. The boundary between dream and reality grows thinner every night.